Oh my goodness. First off, we're running out of fresh potable water worldwide. It's a huge issue that most people have no idea that's actually happening, and it's been happening for quite a while now. And it's because we have we have tons of water all over the earth, but 97% of that water is saline in the ocean. Mm-hmm. The rest of that fresh water, most of it is actually in snow caps, in snowmelt, followed then by groundwater and then by surface. Because I'm like, this is such a thing to understand. Well, I don't understand. And politics like to confuse things, I think, or divide things and make them issues to argue about and things like that. And I'm like, no, we need to come together. And this is an issue that we all have to come together about. So
we have to fix this. We don't have time for your politics. No. We have to fix this.
We have to fix this now. This is the data. This is the science. But there's a huge issue right now where science is actually under attack. But the problem is the rate at which it's currently warming is the big difference here. The rate at which it's warmed is unprecedented for anything we've studied. And we can compare it to the actual rock record, to the ice core records, to the dendrochronology, to the oxygen 1816 isotopes in shells of marine organisms that actually record past climate. And we can compare all these proxies and determine, the rate at which climate changed in the past was never this fast. Ever. We're talking thousands of years versus now 200.
Welcome in, everyone. Thank you for being here. RockitSage is going to join us in I'm going to pull up a few things really quick, make sure we're all ready. We will be talking about water issues, climate change, and her perspectives on that. So, again, if you have any questions, make sure that you enter them into the question queue. All right, chat. Settle it down with your puns. It's time. Hello. Oh my goodness. Welcome in. How are you doing?
I can't complain. I'm a little tired. I just got back in from traveling we camped for 3 nights and did a bunch of geology for 4 days. And I'm ready just to chill for the day. I'm pretty happy. But it makes me so happy being out there. It just feels really right. If that makes sense.
You have been out in the field with your stream teaching geology, haven't you? In the field while you're camping. That's so cool. Where at? State-wise and stuff.
So I'm in California, and I teach a course at a local university called California Geology. So I've taken that course along with the textbook that I use by David Prothero. I think it's called California's Amazing Geology. It's really, really good. It's a bit technical, but it's really, really good. And with that and some other textbooks that I have, I just travel around and I bring my live view, and anywhere there's signal and there's geology and there's rocks, I'm like, oh my God, let's go live. Rock. And then I talk about the rock.
I love this.
Sometimes there's no signal and I just have to go with the flow and wherever it's live view only works with signal.
Speaking of which, what else do you do? I know you teach geology on your stream, but you teach in general, don't you? Mm-hmm. And what degree do you have?
So I have a master's degree in geology, and I have 2 bachelors, one of which is actually in religious studies because I got curious and I wanted to learn about Eastern religion. So I just took some courses and I was like, I just need 6 more classes and I have another degree. Okay, I'll do that. And so I just did that. And then, so that was in tandem with my geology bachelor's, and I did my bachelor's in geology, and I was bartending at the time. And I remember the chair of the department calling me, and he's like, you need to quit your job. The NSF is going to pay for you to do your master's here. And I'm like, holy shit, are you kidding me? And so I'm like, I'll quit my job. I mean, I totally never worked there on the weekends after that at all. But I loved that bar. It was great. It was a little hole in the wall. It was cute as hell. Aww. But I got very, very, very lucky. I went off to do my PhD, and mental health and physical health hit me, and I had to unfortunately leave. But I came back to teach at Cal State, and I've been teaching there for just over 5 years now.
Wow. And how have you enjoyed that?
I love it. I never thought I'd like teaching. I thought I'd be researching forever. And I still do research, but the teaching is so rewarding. Those light bulb moments and those students and the moments they're like, that's how a volcano works? That's how an earthquake works? Those are the moments that I realize I love teaching. I'm like, oh my gosh, you didn't know that? Of course, I'll tell you more. What, do you want videos? I'll give you videos.
The joy is, no, I absolutely hear you on that. Speaking of which, moving over, I wanted to say, we've been diving a little bit into like climate change and stuff. Would you mind dropping the basics of climate change? Could you give a really, really basic kind of explanation of what's happening?
Sure. So basically, there's a lot of models, and I'm sure that many of you have seen, there's all of this different like clashing information, oftentimes in the media, especially when it's politically involved. So I don't do any of the politically involved parts. I just teach the science of it. Mm-hmm. And there are many models. And the reason there are so many models about climate is because climate has a myriad of variables that are very, very difficult to pin down altogether. But these models do an excellent job of doing that nonetheless. Now, they might differ. These various different groups of researchers might differ slightly in their outcomes of those models. And they use variables, tons of things that are controlling the climate of the Earth. And it is a lot. But overall, all of the groups of research does agree that, in fact, we are anthropogenically increasing not only the CO2 content in the atmosphere, but the overall temperature globally on Earth.
That was actually going to be my next question, is because I hear a lot of people, they say, well, the climate does change. We have these shifts in the climate throughout as time progresses. But is it true that we're actually supposed to be getting colder, and because of humans and human activity, we are actually getting warmer?
So it's a bit of a tricky situation because there's what's called glacial and interglacial cycles that are naturally occurring. And we can track this. And on average, let's say there's about 280 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere on average throughout the Earth's, let's say, the last 800,000 years. And that is the actual statistic. We are currently at 410 parts per million. We are insanely high for what we're normally at. And furthermore, it's not just that we're high, because people might ask, well, there have been other high periods in the past where the CO2 concentration's been extremely. I'm like, yeah, that's true. It has. It's always fluctuated. There are, glacial cycles, interglacials, and the interglacials are warmer and the glacials are colder. But the problem is the rate at which it's currently warming is the big difference here. The rate at which it's warmed is unprecedented for anything we've studied. And we can compare it to the actual rock record, to the ice core records, to the dendrochronology, to the oxygen 1816 isotopes in shells of marine organisms that actually record past climate. And we can compare all these proxies and determine, the rate at which climate changed in the past was never this fast. Ever. We're talking thousands of years versus now 200. It's pretty extreme. And yes, there have been also mass extinctions in the past, but the problem is the rate at which it's currently warming is also affecting so many other things globally that it's also causing what we're going through is another mass extinction. We're actually undergoing another mass extinction right now.
Only the difference being this is human caused, and the rate at which the heating is happening is intense. Okay, interesting. So,
but that mass extinction isn't just climate related. It's also, of course, humans do all sorts of stuff.
Yeah. So you already kind of went into the different models a little bit, but I wanted to dive into that. Oh, no, that's perfect. I had a question. I had run into this concept of like the runaway greenhouse effect.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this? And I was talking to my roommate because she's studying a little bit about this. And I was like, well, what are some of the things you're concerned about? And she's like, have you heard about the runaway greenhouse effect? Where basically, I guess what happened is we've seen this happen on Venus. Venus used to have water.
So Venus is a bit different. If I remember correctly, currently Venus is like 600 or something degrees Fahrenheit on the surface of that planet. It's ridiculous. The CO2 concentrations are extremely high. And I know that both planets started out very, very similarly, but Venus is so much closer to the sun that the heat involved there, I think, contributed a lot more to the overall warming of that planet, whereas we're a little bit farther away. That being said, the rate at which we're pumping a lot of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide into the atmosphere could potentially get us to what's called a tipping point. And once we hit that tipping point, that runaway greenhouse effect could easily take over, at which point it's going to be way harder to mitigate any changes. Because it's kind of like an exponential reaction. It's like somebody, and you may have heard this analogy, somebody pushing a snowball up a hill. At some point, that snowball is going to get to the top and start rolling down on its own and accelerating. And that's essentially what's going to happen, because these different gases all do different things. CO2 lasts longer in the atmosphere, for example, than methane, but methane heats up way faster. And as, let's say, the glaciers continue to melt, more methane is going to increase, thereby increasing the rate at which everything starts to heat. And that's just one example of a feedback loop. Then there's albedo. There's all sorts of variables that are going to inevitably become part of that feedback loop. It's not just one thing. It's actually quite a few things.
And that's why it makes the model so like complicated and differing, right? Is that there are just so many variables. We've
got volcanic activity. We've got wind patterns. We've got oceanic currents that change. We've got the thermohaline circulation of the ocean itself. We've got different kinds of, even biology contributes. You've got the atmosphere, you've got geology, you've got biology, and all of these things are just contributing to one another in this big, big cycle that is our ecosystem and our Earth. And we are drastically changing that. And it's crazy to think that we can, but really what it comes down to is the Earth has truly been overrun by humans. That's really what it comes down to. There's just so many of us. And we need more efficient ways of doing things because, quite frankly, I like to be more positive and just, maybe there were some bad people, but at the same time, I think we just didn't fully understand 100 years ago what the hell we were doing. It was about in 1960 that a Hawaiian geologist discovered the increase of CO2 in the atmosphere.
Yeah, and I guess we'll get into that a little bit later. It's interesting to acknowledge that we knew about this, or we're starting to know about this about 60 years ago, and we need to make some changes.
Absolutely. We've known about this for quite a while. And I think what it comes down to is people with money.
Yeah.
And what industries do the people with money control? That's what it comes down to.
Exactly. So we know there are a lot of differences. There is some agreement on this is unprecedented change. Do we have any agreement? I know that the models differ, and it's going to be really, really hard to make any accurate predictions because there's just so much happening. But is there any agreement on predictions, especially for, of course, the tipping point is going to be a huge conversation. Are there any somewhat trustworthy, somewhat agreed upon time frames for that?
I don't think we really know when that tipping point is going to happen. As far as I'm aware, I don't think we fully understand when it's going to happen. We are just hoping that it doesn't happen soon. Because once that happens, it's going to be very, very disastrous in ways we don't even fully understand.
Okay. Yeah, that's something that is always lingering on my mind. So I guess that the message we take from that is we don't know when it's going to happen, but we need to do something, and probably like as soon as you can possibly do something, which would be today,
yesterday, 10 years ago,
yesterday. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And so I know that you study groundwater. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
What is that study called again?
Oh, hydrogeology.
Oh, that's very big. There we go. Hydrogeology. How will groundwater be impacted? Is it being impacted, and how so?
Oh my goodness. First off, we're running out of fresh potable water worldwide. It's a huge issue that most people have no idea that's actually happening, and it's been happening for quite a while now. And it's because we have we have tons of water all over the earth, but 97% of that water is saline in the ocean. Mm-hmm. The rest of that fresh water, most of it is actually in snow caps, in snowmelt, followed then by groundwater and then by surface water. So the streams and the rivers really aren't a huge. I mean, they're a significant component of the water that we use, but oftentimes those are also replenished by the water that's in the ground, which is an important cycle itself, the hydrocycle. So groundwater is one of the biggest sources of our fresh water globally, for agriculture especially, because when it comes down to water use, globally, I'd say on average, it's about 75% is used for agriculture, 25% is used for people. But plants, as well as humans, need certain qualities of water. And it's becoming, well, there's actual water wars that are happening now. Argentina is in a bad situation because of various crops. Avocados out there are so water intensive that they've rapidly depleted a lot of the groundwater there, and it's just continuously going down. California's got serious issues with sinking of the land's surface because the rate at which the groundwater actually refills is so slow. We're talking tens of thousands of years, but we're using it very, very, very quickly. We're getting into the deep parts of aquifers that's called or considered fossil water. I mean, it's only 20,000 years old or something, but I mean, relative to us, that's old.
I was going to say,
right?
It's only 20,000 years old.
Well, I'm thinking geologically of the scale of the whole Earth, but it's considered fossil water, and we're getting into that, and it's not going to replenish at the rate at which we're using it, unfortunately. Not only that, but the more that we use, because a lot of any kind of elements that are in the water, and there's always parts per million of stuff, just salts, things that are floating around, ions, various elements. The further down in an aquifer you go, the more the parts per million of whatever's in there increases. So you might have more and more saline or briny water, and it starts to become unusable as you drill into it. There are contamination issues in Bangladesh, for example. They've got aquifers that they've drilled into, and in the 70s, they I think it was the UN supplied a bunch of money, millions of dollars for wells to help them with potable water, but all of their water is actually naturally contaminated with arsenic. So things can be naturally contaminated too. We can contaminate them via oil spills and sewage and animal treatment and all sorts of other things too. But there's South Africa. South Africa is running out of water. There's water wars going on there. People are drinking. In fact, in some African countries, they have more soda available to them than actual water, and Nestle makes quite a dime off of that. Nestle and Dasani and all. I think is Dasani owned by Nestle? I can't remember, but I hate that.
Not sure, but I was thinking of Nestle because I know Nestle's owner was talking about basically water is not a human right.
Fuck him. Sorry. Oh my God.
No. I'm glad to hear you say it because I was thinking it.
It makes me so mad. I'm like, no, everybody deserves potable drinking water. Everybody.
Yeah.
And nobody knows about it. And California, there's the Resnicks. If you look up this, they're on the Forbes 400 list, the real rich people. They own a bunch of agriculture and other things, and they started getting into buying water. So water isn't entirely privatized, but essentially it is in California because of the way in which these amendments were carried out, such that essentially it's basically privatized. And the Resnicks own a lot of it, and they're sneaky taking it for all of these crops that are super water intensive, and they're depleting it so much that they're putting towns out of water all over the Valley of California, because agriculture is so big here. We supply 55% of the nation's produce.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, we provide a lot of the nation's produce, so we do need to use some of the water, but I think some of the water-intensive crops should maybe be not sold so much. The marketing for like that pomegranate juice, that's a bad one. That's by the Resnicks. Those are fairly water-intensive. Almonds, of course. I've actually switched from almond milk to oat milk. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to determine per calorie, like how much water each crop is taking. Of course, animals and meat that's a huge sector for water. Huge. Because it's not just the animals and what they drink, it's the crops it's actually the alfalfa. And that alfalfa that's grown even in California, it's not even just used here. It's shipped worldwide in some cases. And that alfalfa is the most water intensive crop that is grown here. And it's grown a lot. A lot. I mean, there are images I could send you right now of you can there's a telephone pole out in the San Joaquin Valley where they've posted the dates where the land surface used to be, and it's tens of meters high. The land surface is just sinking. And the worst part about that is, as it sinks, so the water exists in these tiny little pore spaces. Those pore spaces, without that water pressure between them, they start to rearrange and collapse. A lot of that porosity becomes destroyed. Mm-hmm. That's exactly
what
why.
I was wondering. Oh, wow.
And it does depend on the type of rock, oftentimes, as to how much sinking is involved. But a lot of times that ends up in destruction, permanent destruction of porosity. So the storage, permeability, the ability for the water to actually flow. We need both porosity and permeability. Without those two things, you can't get that water.
So will it replenish?
Well, it will replenish to some extent, just not, the storage won't be the same amount. It's increasingly depleting. It'll never go away entirely. There's always going to be some amount of porosity, but we are destroying a lot of that storage, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that's not just here. This is, again, a global issue. I just happen to teach water in the Western U.S. as one of my other courses, so I know a lot about the Western side of things. And I'm trying to influence my university to let me teach more globally, though.
That would be really cool and important just for people to know what's going on. I know I'm disappointed with my education in terms of especially global issues.
Yes.
So that would be huge.
Me too.
And how we're impacting other things globally as well. But with that sinking, does that play into, I've heard the sea levels might rise, or is it that the land is sinking, or is it both?
Well, so as for the land, as to whether or not, so land subsidence, specifically where there's sinking involved, that's just because of overpumping of groundwater in specific areas.
Okay.
You also have tectonic issues where you can have natural sinking of places just because of tectonic changes. You can also have uplift, like the California coastline is actually uplifting right now.
Oh, really?
But sea level's also rising. And the rate at which the sea level is rising, now I'm not 100% sure at the rate at which the uplift is happening on the coast anymore. I used to remember because I did a lot of research on that back in the day. It's out of my brain now, though. But it just depends on the rates and which one's going to be higher. But most of the world most coastal cities are going to become inundated with water as the sea level continues to rise. Yeah. And that's going to happen over the next, 30, 40 years.
And so there are so many questions I have in regards to that. Like, do we keep rebuilding these coastal cities when they get wrecked?
I don't think so.
Yeah, that was a very interesting conversation I heard popping up on one of our more political panels.
Really interesting.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, wow, that's an interesting question I never even heard.
I would actually get involved in politics on that issue.
Okay, well, if I ever see questions like that, I'll reference you. I'll say, hey, get Sage in on this. She knows her stuff.
Coasts are bad to live at anyway. They're so transient. They're not stable features.
What do you mean by that? Oh, coasts just in general because of the damage from... Go ahead.
So most places have like land and atmosphere mixing, right? Well, coastlines, you've got water, land, and atmosphere. So you have a lot of weathering and erosion happening on those areas way more rapidly than other areas on continents. So they're constantly just being broken down, removed, wave activity, wind activity is just breaking them apart. So they're not very long-lasting features. They're very, very quickly changing and transient. And sea level rises and falls are also natural cycles of the Earth. Again, the rate at which it's rising now is faster than we've seen before, partly because, we've got the sea ice melting, and then, of course, as the water heats itself, it becomes a little more, it expands a bit, and it rises also because of the heat itself. But coasts aren't very stable to live on. I personally would never build or live on a coast, maybe inland a bit, but it's... especially, let's say Florida. Florida's highest point is 345 feet elevation. So they're really screwed out. Louisiana, parts of Italy, There's areas in Italy right now. I think Italy is actually tectonically sinking, as well as the coast is rising in parts of it. I think in Venice. So it's Denmark. Yep. There's little island. There's an island or multiple islands off of New Zealand, and the government of New Zealand is starting to allow the natives of those islands to migrate over to the main island because their islands aren't going to be existing for much longer.
Oh, wow.
Like their homes are just going to be flooded. So a lot of those little island nations will just be flooded.
I have a potentially silly question. With that, the runoff greenhouse effect would be evaporating seawater, and yet we're seeing seawater levels rise. I know a part of the seawater levels rising is because we're having the melting from the glaciers. Right?
Yes.
So what all is happening there? We're having the melting of the glaciers, the expanding of the water because it's warming, but will we also lose some of that water potentially because of it evaporating, or?
I don't think, at least initially, the evaporation will be enough. I think it'll have to heat considerably more.
So that would be much
for
later.
The water vapor to change as drastic. But I could be wrong on that. The gases in the atmosphere also do fluctuate naturally quite a bit. We've had in the past lower amounts of oxygen, higher amounts of oxygen, and that's directly affected evolution, which is pretty cool. But now again, it's happening so quickly that it's scary as to how it's going to affect biology on all fronts.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so getting back to these water concerns, what are do you see any technology or do you see anything that could be useful? What can we do to help people who are struggling with water?
Well, I think bringing awareness is going to be a big one because people don't fully know that these are even a lot of people, especially developed nations, don't know about people that are just running out of water. So that's one thing people can do is just make people aware and make sure you're sharing actual information, not just clickbait. That's something I try to remind people. The other thing is for agriculture, you could switch to, for example, a lot of ag is using flood irrigation, which is extremely wasteful. A lot of that water evaporates. Whereas you could do drip irrigation and it saves, I think, some ridiculous amount, at least 25% water, if not more. There are different, I honestly think that we may have to eventually figure out which crops may not be as viable because of how water intensive they could be. I think maybe some things are just a little more luxurious than necessary. Like, how much avocado do I eat? Do I really need that much avocado?
Dang,
is it really that much more water intensive?
Avocado toast.
Right. I love it. I'm such a Californian. I love it. Well, I was just going to say that agriculture, I think, is really going to have to, it's going to have to come down to figuring out a way to more efficiently use water in that sector. And I think overall, we're just going to have to be better about it. Oh, and lawns. Lawns need to stop. If you're in an area that doesn't naturally have grass, stop it.
Yes.
Stop it and get some help.
It's really, really neat and trying to find more environmentally sustainable
that's awesome.
Farming techniques. And one of the things I'm like, I want to learn to do some of the permaculture and related things because I know lawns are just so water intensive. It's wild. Yep.
It's crazy. And I live in a desert and I'm like, you get HOAs. They're like, your lawn's not green enough. I'm like, oh my God, you have no idea what anything in reality is, do you?
HOAs, is that homeowner associations?
I think so. I've never lived in one of those areas, but I hear about that. I hear about that. And then, some neighbors will call the city if your lawn dies, and then they'll come out and try to find you. It just depends on the city that you live in. Some cities will have issues with it. However, there are some cities that are becoming more progressive with water. San Diego is one of them. They actually do fines now if you water your lawn between 10 a.m. and 6 p.m. because it's just going to evaporate. So much of that water is just going to evaporate. It's a terrible time of day. I see my neighbors doing it in the middle of the afternoon, like 3 o'clock. They're watering their lawn. I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to... Why? And then the water's just dripping down the sidewalk, running down the street. And I'm like, that would also be fined in San Diego. Like, they actually look for the runoff on the sidewalks and stuff. I'm like, God, they're serious. And so many people there are switching over to the desert landscaping.
Yeah,
The
that
big,
makes
I
sense.
love it.
That's
Yeah.
good. That's really good.
I think
Oh,
you just
wow.
have to learn to live with the natural plant life that exists in the area that you live in.
Yeah,
That's
absolutely.
it doesn't make sense to have these insane or it just doesn't make any sense. So even though urban doesn't use as much, there's plenty of room for us to be improving. And that's one of them. That's a huge one right there.
And I know we heard a little bit about this already, but in terms of our current focus on economics and profitability in regards to our response to climate change, do you think what we are doing is sustainable? What changes do you think need to happen? I guess one of them would be maybe don't privatize water. We need to be a lot more restrictive on our water and mindful of how we're using our water because we're being wild about it.
Yes.
But what other changes do you think need to happen, or what are you thinking on that?
I wish I knew more about the political sector. It's something that I tend to get very frustrated about. Because I'm like, this is such a thing to understand. Well, I don't understand. And politics like to confuse things, I think, or divide things and make them issues to argue about and things like that. And I'm like, no, we need to come together. And this is an issue that we all have to come together about. So
we have to fix this. We don't have time for your politics.
No.
We have to fix this.
We have to fix this now. Like, this is the data, this is the science. But there's a huge issue right now where science is actually under attack. A lot of science is, I see it sometimes in movies where people are very much like, oh, well, people are relying more on the holistic and they're distrustful of science oftentimes. And I wonder if it's a media driven thing, but that isn't, it really makes me very, very sad because all of the scientists I know, including myself, we're just genuinely passionate about our subjects. We just genuinely want to share the information that we're gathering. And it's important stuff. And we work with other people so that we can keep each other in check and make sure that we're gathering the data correctly and that it's statistically significant. So that trust is a big, big problem that I've seen. And it's mind-boggling to me that there's this distrust in science. And it makes me very, very sad. And I don't know if that's I'm sorry if I'm getting off the topic here because
No.
but that is one it's one thing that really, really I think needs some
work.
Yeah, I think people need that trust again. And I think, well, our government hasn't exactly done much to help build any trust in any sort of organizations whatsoever.
Yeah.
So
That's what I was going to point to.
Like, I'll be straight. I don't trust our government whatsoever. Do I think my government has my best interest for me? No, not even in the least. No, I don't. So I'm just here to share the science and hope that people will come together because ultimately I think it's going to be us, like the people that have to come together and change it because the government is moving too damn slowly. They're too busy fighting because they need those platforms to stand on so they can get those votes. And that's great. But stop using climate as a platform and actually do something about it.
And then we have companies privatizing water.
Yes. And then we've got companies privatizing water.
So it's like,
and then
we need our people.
We've got misinformation even with energy sources. Of course, then there's oil with all the money saying, hey, oil's fine, it's this and that, and we're great, it's fantastic. And well, it's not. I mean, there's definitely cons, and we know those cons. We absolutely know those cons. But there's also pros and cons with other energy sources as well. But overall, I think we need to expand the other things that we're using. And I think we can find solutions for those other cons anyway. They're not nearly as bad.
What energy sources are you particularly interested in? What energy sources would you point to? And would you mind going into that a little bit?
Well, I'm going to be honest. The best and I think the most obvious solution is nuclear. And I know a lot of people shy away from that because, the radioactive waste. And it is a con. It's absolutely something that we have to be aware of. We've gotten so much better at building nuclear power plants. They've become safer and safer, but the accidents that have happened in the past, either because of user error or poor planning, have definitely instilled fear in people. There is a new type of thorium salt reactors are starting to become of interest. And I'm so excited to see this because it actually is much, much less waste than uranium. It does take a tiny bit of uranium to kickstart the reaction, but it uses thorium primarily instead. It also doesn't take a copious amount of water to cool the system down, so you don't have to build it near any oceans like Fukushima, for example, that got destroyed by a tsunami. So that would also be mitigated. So you could put these things in different in a more variety of areas that are a little safer, and the waste isn't nearly as much, and it would supply a ton of energy. And we wouldn't be putting CO2 and all sorts of other gases into the atmosphere by burning them. But we are going to have to develop all this infrastructure to do it. That's going to be expensive. And who's going to pay for that? We probably would. Wind is okay. It's not extremely efficient, but it's great where there, of course, are windy areas. And so I'm a proponent of that. There is an issue with recycling the blades. In the past, they used to just bury them in Wisconsin under the ground. So they were like all about, we recycle everything. No, they didn't. They didn't. They were putting the blades underground in Wisconsin, but I think they are starting to develop ways to actually recycle those blades. I think that is actually coming to an end. Okay. So that makes me happy. But the windmills themselves have maybe a lifespan of 25 years, so that's also going to be costly. I'm not sure exactly how much, but that is something to be aware of. There's going to be the cost of maintaining those. Solar panels have about a similar lifespan where you have to... Oh gosh, I think you're going to have to redo the surfaces with rare earth elements, and rare earth elements is going to require mining. There's also cement involved on the solar panels. Solar panels or cement produces tons of CO2 just by production, although they are making better methods of cement production. I find tons and tons of information. There's so many people doing so many good things with developing ways to produce cement for cheaper in terms of CO2 footprint. Ways to cycle out CO2 from the atmosphere, carbon sequestration, which we can talk about in a minute because I know tons about that, which is a really good thing to mitigate this. But ultimately, I think it's going to be a combo of solar, wind, and ultimately the biggest sector probably will be nuclear I hope. I think it's the solution. And then hopefully phase out as much as possible the fossil fuels because they're releasing just so many gases. And the hydro I have an issue with because dams not only require a shit ton of cement, but they also have issues ecologically for a variety of species, especially fish.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So even the runways that they have for the fish to go through don't work that well. And they're actually dumbing the fish down because they now use the breeding pools, which don't allow for new genetics to enter into the breeding process. So they're just dumbing the fish down. And so they become less and less survivable once they're released into the wild. Natural selection has its way with them, unfortunately.
Oof.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's breeding pools for what? Why?
For fish. I know. Well, because they don't make it out to sea like they used to. For example, salmon runs. The salmon used to go through those dams and things, but they keep them from, the Pacific Northwest all through so many of the rivers out of the Sierra Nevada used to be filled with salmon. Just filled. Salmon really shouldn't be that expensive, but it is because of all the damming. There was a huge damming boom in the U.S. between the 30s and the 80s. It was around the 70s and the 80s where environmentalists started to become involved and like, hey, you guys need to quit this. They're like, damn everything, hydroelectric, they went nuts and didn't realize the ecological issues that could come from that. There were beautiful estuaries that just dried up. All the species that exist in an estuaries are very, very interesting and diverse and unique environments, and they've destroyed quite a. They're where the big rivers meet the ocean. So you've got a mixture of some saline materials with fresh water. So you get a really unique and diverse ecosystem in these areas that, for example, the estuary of the Colorado was dried up for quite a while until we started letting water back through to Mexico.
Oh, wow. Okay.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
Colorado's got issues. There's so many issues.
Alrighty. So, what are some solutions you're seeing? You wanted to get into carbon
Yes.
sequestering? Carbon what?
So carbon sequestration. So literally you sequester something away. That's what it is. You're just putting it away. So what they're doing, and there's different ways that they're doing this. What I studied during my master's was to actually pump CO2. What they would do is put it under a ton of pressure until it becomes a supercritical fluid. So it exists that way because of the pressure conditions. But if it were to escape those conditions, it would turn back into a gas very, very rapidly and that would be quite dangerous, right? So it's turned into supercritical fluid. So we have to make sure that as a supercritical fluid, it's going to stay where we put it. So we looked at old oil reservoirs, things that have been depleted. And we're like, hey, there's some empty reservoirs here. And they're not big caverns underground. I just want to make that clear. They're, again, just like the water, groundwater. They're just, the oil and the gas exists in pore spaces between grains of rock, just like an aquifer of water. So when you deplete an oil reservoir, you actually don't get all of the oil out of it because it's so sticky. It coats all of the grains inside that reservoir. So one of the ways that we were trying to push CO2 sequestration, at least in this way, was saying, hey, oil companies, pump CO2 as a supercritical fluid from your factories, directly from your factories into the ground, so you're not releasing the CO2 in the atmosphere. And it also acts as a enhanced oil recovery. So we were trying to sell it as a positive, hey, it also will allow you to get that excess oil that's coating the grains because there's tons of it in there still. But it wasn't cost beneficial enough for them, so a lot of them don't do it. It was being done in Texas. I'm not sure which companies were doing it, but they actually do pump that CO2, but it requires that it's deep enough, the reservoir is big enough, and that it's not going to escape for 1,000 years, and that the parts per million in the water, if there's water that's there, it's so high that it's undrinkable. So it's got to be an unusable reservoir, essentially, that's not going to escape. Meanwhile, in Iceland, this is where it actually, I think, is cool. They take CO2, and instead of pumping it and making it a supercritical fluid, they carbonate water with it, just like soda water, right?
What?
CO2, right? So
wait, can you drink?
Well, I don't know. I don't think you could drink it. It's probably ocean water.
Wait,
I don't know.
Are they putting this in people's
No. So they're carbonating the water, and they're pumping that carbonated water into the ground.
Okay.
Where it precipitates, and it makes minerals in the ground permanently. Naturally occurring minerals.
What?
Yes. Specifically calcite. You may have heard of calcite. It's a fairly common one.
What do we,
maybe not.
Do we use that for anything? Is that does that produce something that could be useful, or is it just kind of awesome?
It's just a CO2 sink. It's a storage for CO2. Calcite's a naturally occurring mineral on Earth that does naturally trap CO2. So when they found that it could do that, that's even better because that CO2 isn't going to escape. It's actually it's being leached out of the solution, the water. Instead of that carbonated water, right? It's actually forming minerals. So then the water is fine. It's just
that's really
they are exactly
cool.
classic. So CO2 is actually a common end member in many minerals, and that group of minerals is called carbonate because of the carbon in it. And those minerals are natural traps for CO2 that exist in the form of big rock piles called limestone. And then limestone is used for concrete, so they re-release that CO2 when they dig it up, unfortunately.
Something that could also help is, from my understanding, it's more trees, right?
Yes, trees would be great. I mean, I've read some things that just planting more trees isn't going to be enough, and of course, it's probably not going to be enough, but it'll help.
Yeah, because we're going to have several solutions, aren't we?
Because they're, of course, also carbon sinks, and they release oxygen, so that's a great thing. I love trees, too. Trees are fantastic.
So some solutions. I want to go ahead and pull up some of the questions. Jay said, since fossil fuel companies are the biggest employers of geologists, how can we do a better job of employing that talent on greener projects?
I don't know if it's the biggest employer of geologists. It probably is, though. I've never seen a breakdown of the statistics of where we end up. But I won't lie, most of the master's degree that I went through, most of those people did want to go in oil because it pays so well. And that's really what it comes down to. It's the money. Oil pays so much money. There was an individual who started with their bachelor's. They were in their master's and they were expected to have finished their master's for their position, but they were allowed to start without even having finished their master's with making over triple digits a year. It's a lucrative business, and that's why people go into it. And a senior petroleum geologist will make $250,000 a year, $250,000 a year, with a master's degree. And a master's degree is what, 2-3 years of work. So it's very much worth it, because you'll go from being a geotech making 60,000 to what, over 100. So a lot of people, depending on the department, did like to go for their master's. I was the weirdo in there who wanted to learn more geology and study and climb rocks. And I'm like, I think oil, I mean, the science behind how oil is made is interesting to me, what happens to organic materials and the chemistry and all that, and even the puzzle of how it exists and where to find it is interesting, but I don't have any interest in going into the field otherwise, no.
That makes sense. So do you think we would just need to be investing more to get more people in greener projects? We've got to invest in green projects.
They're going to have to get paid more. People go where the money is, sadly. And oil gets so much money from the government. And they also, I think, give money to the government, too. Isn't it kind of a...
That's kind of...
Doesn't it go both ways? God, there's...
Yeah. So I was really hopeful that we would see some good come out of Biden's infrastructure plan, because I know there was like a climate core and stuff in that, but unfortunately, I think it's getting whittled down a little, and continues to be whittled down, as you know, with the back and forth.
Yeah.
So that's something I'm a little bit hopeful for, and I think we need to really push on. So Jay wanted to know, what are some promising proposals for solutions to California's water problems?
Sustainable Groundwater Management Act has recently been proposed. And I think they're giving it about 20 years to ideally sustain. The historic passage of SGMA in 2014 set forth a statewide framework to help protect groundwater resources over the long term. SGMA is compromised from a 3-bill legislative package. And this was when Jerry Brown was in office. He went and passed this. And it requires local agencies to form groundwater sustainability agencies. So they essentially have to hire hydrogeologists and make sure what they're doing is sustainable, but they're a little bit vague as to what some of that is. So regulatory oversight through evaluation and assessment, providing ongoing assistance to locals through the development of best management practices and guidance, planning assistance, technical assistance, and financial assistance. Because it's just being used. Here's a resource for more information on SGMA. This was again. Oh, thank you, Jay. You've already got it.
Yep.
So that's what I was actually looking at. And I've clicked a series of pages from there that describe the best management practices, the assistant and engagement data and tools. The Monterey amendments before that were the amendments that essentially made water kind of semi-privatized without being officially privatized. They're real sneaky about it. So I hope they don't really tackle that with this, but I really hope that they do something, and that people with ridiculous amounts of money don't just get away with sucking the water up like they've been doing.
Yeah. So would you want to see legislation against privatizing water?
Yes, 100%. I would love to see legislation against privatizing water. It should be for the people, and we should find the most beneficial way to use this. The only thing is that I don't know, when it comes to agriculture, that's going to be very complex, because you've got farms that have been doing whatever produce that they've been doing. So I suspect a lot of farmers may have to be subsidized and helped, and I think that's fully okay. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. If that means we're going to be more sustainable.
Yeah, we need to take care of our food, our water.
I don't think it should be on the farmers to have to pay for those changes. I think it should be everyone. We change it together.
Absolutely.
Because it's for everyone.
Yeah. No, I completely hear you on that. Sandoval says, I keep hearing about these new technologies that would allow us to make seawater drinkable. Is large-scale implementation of them just science fiction?
No, it's actually happening. So desalination of water is happening in Israel. That's one of the reasons they have so much fresh water, because it's a desert there. They don't really have much, so they have to rely on desal. We've got a desalination plant off the coast of San Diego as well, and that's going to be our future, I think. I don't know that we will get it in. I don't know that we'll get it together quickly enough to use the resources that we have sustainably, because consider this. Climate change is also impacting our water. Because the snowpacks are melting, those snowpacks feed so many aquifers. So the Sierra Nevada glaciers, those snowpacks on the Sierra Nevada, they feed a huge portion through snowmelt annually, a natural process every year, and it recharges that aquifer. Well, once the snowpacks continue to melt and melt and melt away, well, the recharge is going to be minimal, very, 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 very minimal. So it's going to become worse, not better. So I fully suspect that we will rely on desalination to a large extent. Yeah. And it is expensive.
Part of the water future.
Yep. And it's expensive as hell when it comes to energy, which is why I always go back to nuclear. Doesn't seem to be, I don't see any other solution.
Spork was wondering, do you have any suggestions for getting people to stop being in denial about these issues?
Kindness and wisdom. Approach people with kindness and just share the information with kindness. I don't know how to put it. Like, hey, I read this article. I found the evidence, or not the evidence, make sure that it's maybe a peer-reviewed source and it's not just a clickbait media that might put that person off. Let's say they're politically on one end and you're sharing an article that's biased to the other side politically, they'll probably dismiss that entirely, right? Mm-hmm. So maybe find the source of the information so that it's not a biased source, so that they don't immediately put up their defenses. Mm-hmm. That might be one way. But just generally, just through kindness. And I unfortunately, even through trying to explain, I've even sometimes it doesn't always work. Some people are just that they've made it that part of their personality or ideologies, kind of like a flat earther. If you've ever watched the documentary Behind the Curve, it's kind of like that.
Oh boy.
And there's only so much you can do when somebody gets to that extent, that point. And I think you kind of notice it because they get a glazed look in their eye when you're talking, and you can tell they just tune out. And so you're just kind of like, okay, well, I tried. So not everybody is going to be reachable, but those that are, the best way to do it is through kindness, not arguing. Don't argue. The moment it gets heated, I would just say, hey, maybe we should talk about this when we're not so heated next time. And
I see, yeah, let's calm
because
it down.
It shouldn't be a political topic, but it is, unfortunately.
Absolutely. I bet you deal with that. Do you get a lot of climate denial on your channel, like in your chat, or not really?
Sometimes, oftentimes people will come in and if I can tell they come in with like an edgy, like, attitude about it, I'll just, in my kind of university professor way, just explain it to them like I would any student. And usually I'd say 80% of the time, they kind of like, oh, okay. And then they'll start actually asking questions and contribute. Ooh. But then you get like 1 out of 5 that are just anger, just pure rage. And they're, you know how that goes.
Yeah.
Just gotta pick them.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think we got into geothermal energy, right?
Oh, geothermal is another great resource. I can't believe I didn't even...
Yeah, Sandoval was asking, is geothermal energy a viable option? What are the cons of it?
Geothermal is great. You just have to... The cons are it's not available everywhere because you ideally want areas where there's going to be extremely hot crust. For example, not all of the crust is uniform. It's a very, very weird Earth system that we live on. So if you've got a really thick, let's say the Himalayas aren't going to have any geothermal because they are not volcanically active. They're very thick continental material. You're not going to get through there. Whereas Basin and Range, California is extremely thin. And it's also got all of this heat, magmatic heat, because it's extending. So it's easy to tap into that geothermal. Iceland's another example. It's volcanically active, so it's extremely easy to tap into that geothermal. So you want to find areas where it's going to be easy and inexpensive to use. So otherwise you're going to be drilling through way too much rock for it to ever be viable to get to that heat.
I have a quick question. What could you give me? I'm picking up some of what geothermal is, but what is geothermal?
It's just naturally occurring heat. The Earth is just hot. It produces heat, and there's different areas in which it produces heat either via hot springs, and it's usually always because of volcanic activity or magmatic activity in the asthenosphere. And the way in which we could tap into it is I think via steam. We can use steam. I believe they pump water down and it generates steam, and that generates electricity, I think, but I'm not exactly sure. I was able to describe it once. It's actually a fairly simple process. It's a really simple process, and it doesn't really there aren't cons with it that I've found with, like, let's say hydro and building dams.
Fish, yeah.
There really aren't any big cons that I've ever seen with it. They don't take rare earth elements. It doesn't take a copious amount of cement. Hawaii. Japan. Oh, absolutely, Japan. Canary Islands. Yeah, there's tons of places worldwide that are using geothermal. I mean, yeah, I guess the con is you're potentially near a volcano, but a lot of people live near volcanoes. Unknowingly, actually.
Oh.
People probably don't realize a lot of mountains are active that are.
Huh.
Iceland is huge for geothermal. They're so ahead of the game.
Another question on geothermal from Cirque Amy. Might use the geothermal in tectonically volcanically active areas like California, Yosemite, Iceland reduce the likelihood of earthquake and or eruptions? Is that a possibility? Excuse me.
It wouldn't reduce any earthquake likelihoods at all. It wouldn't. We have no real way of mitigating eruptions or earthquakes. The Earth is just going to do what the Earth does. And you have to imagine that, like, we might drill into a small little tiny area for geothermal, but tectonic plates are massive. And it's not just an area, it's a volume. It's a volume of earth and rock. And it's just colliding or shearing or pulling. And it's way more energy than we could ever possibly imagine controlling. So no, we really can't do much on that.
Going back to, I think, the discussion on calcite and sequestering carbon, are there any consequences of abnormal levels of calcite that would arise if that's how that works anyway, said Free Finch?
I don't think so. Calcite's a really benign mineral that occurs everywhere. It's a very common mineral in shallow marine environments, but I don't see any way in which it would. I mean, it might dissolve at some point because of something acidic, but that also already happens with CO2-rich minerals and rock. So that's normal because rain is naturally slightly acidic. It's got a pH of 5.6. Neutral 7, 5.6 is just slightly acidic. So over time, because CO2 or rocks with CO2 in them are susceptible more so than other rock types to that acidity, they will eventually dissolve. But that's normal. That's just weathering and erosion.
Thank you. Jalen Jean was asking, any idea on how geologists can show solidarity and support with indigenous peoples, especially Arctic peoples who are being most impacted by climate crisis?
I don't know how to answer that. I feel dumb, but I don't know how to answer that very well.
That's okay. That is totally
It's a great question.
And I think that we're very lucky. Jalen Jean is often around here bringing up those questions that can be really difficult to answer in regards to how can we better support our indigenous population?
Well, I know there are a lot of geologists that do this already. They work on volcanoes in areas that aren't supported very well because of just that. There are a lot of areas. I mean, God, I could actually list a couple people either on Twitter or on Twitch that actively do work for maybe water drinkability, so potable water issues, as well as helping indigenous areas. So, for example, one area would be Goma. The city of Goma was recently under an eruption from near Gongo, I believe. And it's a very active volcano, and they live just at the base of this volcano, and it's a fairly big city, but they don't really get a lot of help because they don't have very much money. So recently, there's been a team of geologists going out to install a variety of seismic stations, little seismographs to read the seismicity and to read any changes in ground deformation and all the things that volcanologists look for to get an idea of when a volcano might start being active. So they're trying to help that area. And it's not the only area that is trying to be helped from volcanic activity specifically. Arctic areas, I'm not sure off the top of my head. I wouldn't have an answer for Arctic areas. But I know the sea ice there is melting rapidly, and there's going to be issues with that too. There are going to be issues with so many areas. And I know myself, I am more than happy to help. If ever I had the opportunity to travel and help, I would. Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, there was another documentary I saw that they were showing people where CO2 was naturally, or no, carbon monoxide was naturally seeping out of the ground, and it was, you can't smell it, but if you inhale it, you can pass out and die. It'll suffocate you, asphyxiate you. And this was, I think, in a similar area. And so what they did, a team of geologists came in and demonstrated, and it was hard to watch because I love animals, but they brought this goat in to demonstrate, right? And they brought the goat, and the goat passed out, but they grabbed the goat and they put it on a little oxygen tank, and the goat came back and it was fine. The goat was totally fine. But it stressed me out because I'm like, oh my God, that goat.
Yeah.
But just to demonstrate to the villagers there what would happen and why that area. And I was like, wow, that's a real way to show the children, and like, this is dangerous. Mm-hmm. You can't see it, but it's danger. Mm-hmm. So there are definitely teams of people doing things to help other areas that aren't as well educated or areas that don't have the infrastructure. Indonesia's a really bad one. Indonesia gets hit all the time by volcanic activity, earthquakes, tsunamis. They are a geologic train wreck. Mm. It's terrifying. But there are definitely teams, and it's not just geologists, by far it's not just geologists that try to help with these things. And I think really it comes down to the education, because 20, 30 years ago, a lot of these nations were on their own with tsunami warnings, for example. But because we can globally communicate now, we can actually warn other countries of far-field tsunamis, because when a tsunami happens, they travel over the ocean and can potentially hit countries across the sea. So we can now warn other countries. And so we've gotten better at actually helping countries with less infrastructure in some ways. Mm. So there is some positives, but there's definitely more to be done.
Tragically Hipster was saying, this is a silly question. Is there a strange thing in geology that happens that is just really interesting to you?
All of it. I think it's all interesting.
I'm like, if you want this question answered, just pop by RockitSage's stream and just vibe for a while, and you'll hear. I love it. Like, you swing by, and I feel like at least once a stream, she's nerding out about something awesome.
My students tell me, because I'm like, oh my God, this is one of my favorite topics. They're like, you say that about every topic. Oh,
your passion is very contagious. It's incredible.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to wrap up our questions with one last one from me. But don't worry, if you have additional questions, feel free to swing by the next time that we have Sage on, because as long as she would like to join us again, yes, I would love to pull her over. But if you have a question you'd like to get answered more immediately, please swing by her stream. Drop her a follow. Catch her when she's live. I wanted to know, well, okay, first off, nope. We'll end with this one. What gives you hope with all of this unfolding? What gives you hope?
Well, people like you, all of you guys in chat for listening to this. Literally all of you here. You guys give me the hope, and that's why I continue doing this. And also cats. I love cats.
Oh my goodness. Well, thank you so much, Sage, for
Thank you for having me.
Yes. No, it's our pleasure. Thank you so much for bringing all of your knowledge. Thank you for doing what you do, and have a lovely rest of your day.
You too, my dear.